The night silence in the city's residential outskirts has a particular sticky aftertaste. It is not the kind of peace that brings rest, but rather the lull before something inevitable. Artem was 40. His life consisted of predictable cycles of the office, coffee, reports, and evening walks with Graf, a massive German shepherd whose muzzle had already begun to turn gray. Graf was the only reason Artem ventured outside after 11 p.m. when the streetlights began to flicker sickly and the streets emptied. That evening, the air was thick and humid. Fog settled on the asphalt in thin, oily droplets. They were walking their usual route past the stadium. Graf usually ran ahead, straining the leash, but this time he suddenly stopped. His ears twitched and a low, barely audible growl rumbled in his chest. Artem looked back. 50 meters away, under a solitary lamp, stood a figure, a tall man in a dark, long trench coat, his hood pulled so low that his face was a void of shadow. He was just standing there. "Let's go, Graf," Artem said quietly, tugging the leash. He quickened his pace. A minute later, Artem looked back again. The figure was moving. He wasn't running, nor was he trying to hide. The man walked with a steady, measured stride. The distance didn't shrink, but it didn't grow either. The stranger's boots clicked against the asphalt with metronomic precision. Artem turned into an alleyway between rows of garages, a shortcut, but a dark one. He hoped the pursuer was simply heading his own way and would stay on the main street. However, as soon as they plunged into the darkness, the rhythmic footsteps behind them did not vanish. They echoed off the metal walls of the garages. Graf began to act strange. The dog, trained to protect, was now constantly looking back with his tail tucked between his legs. This terrified Artem the most. If a shepherd feels fear instead of aggression, it means whatever is following them doesn't fit a dog's understanding of a human. "Who's there?" Artem shouted, stopping dead. His voice cracked. The footsteps behind him stopped instantly. Total silence. Artem could only see a dark silhouette at the entrance of the alley. The stranger didn't answer. He just waited. Artem felt cold sweat trickling down his spine. He turned and practically bolted. He burst onto a lit street, hoping to see anyone, a taxi, a late pedestrian, a light in a window. But the city seemed dead. The windows of the apartment blocks stared at him like empty eye sockets. He looked back. The same man in the coat emerged from the garages. His steps rang out again, asterisk, click, 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 asterisk. He didn't speed up even when Artem broke into a run. That was the most terrifying part, the stranger's absolute confidence. He knew Artem had nowhere to go. He knew that exhaustion would eventually take its toll. Artem felt his lungs begin to burn. 40 is not the best age for sprinting. Graf panted heavily beside him, his claws scraping against the concrete. "What do you want?" Artem screamed, gasping for air. The pursuer remained silent. He was closer now. Now Artem could see details. The coat was dirty, stained with something dark, and not even the sound of breathing came from under the hood. The man walked as if he were a mechanism wound up for one single purpose: to follow the trap. Artem reached his apartment building, fumbling feverishly in his pockets for his keys. His hands shook so violently that he dropped the ring. The keys fell with a metallic clang into the sewer grate. "Amit," he wheezed. The footsteps were closing in. They sounded right around the corner of the building now. Artem lunged toward the playground, hoping to hide behind the labyrinth of slides and tunnels. He crawled into a plastic tube slide, clamping his hand over Graf's snout to keep him from growling. Through the cracks, he saw the pursuer enter the playground. He stopped in the middle of the sandbox. Artem held his breath. His heart was hammering so loudly he feared it could be heard across the street. The stranger slowly turned his head toward the slide. Under the hood, there was no face, only skin as white as a corpse and two hollow pits where eyes should be. He wasn't searching. He knew. The pursuer began to walk slowly toward the tube. He pulled something long and shiny from his pocket. It wasn't a knife. It looked like a surgical bone saw. The final stand. Graf couldn't take it anymore. The shepherd broke free from Artem's grip and lunged at the man with a fierce bark. But something happened that Artem didn't expect. The stranger didn't even flinch. He made a sharp movement with his hand, and Graf was sent flying sideways, yelping in pain. A dog that could take down a grown man was tossed aside like a ragdoll. Artem scrambled out of the tube. Fear turned into pure adrenaline. He couldn't leave his dog, but he couldn't help him either. "Get back!" he screamed, grabbing a heavy branch from the ground. The stranger stopped. For the first time, he lifted his head fully. Artem saw his lips. They were sewn shut with thick black thread. The entity Artem could no longer call it a man took a step forward. The stride was unnaturally long. Artem turned and scrambled up the fire escape of the neighboring 5-story building. He climbed, feeling the cold iron cut into his palms. Behind him, he heard those same rhythmic steps confidently ascending the metal stairs. Asterisk click, click, click dot asterisk. He reached the roof. There was nowhere left to go, only the edge and the void below. The pursuer peered at the roof's edge. He stood in the fog that had risen to the 5th floor. He began to slowly cut the threads on his lips with that surgical saw. Black blood dripped onto his coat. When the last thread was cut, he opened his mouth. A sound came out that made Artem's hair turn white at the temples. It wasn't a scream. It was a recording of his own voice from 10 minutes ago. "Who's there? What do you want?" The entity took one final step. "Get away from me!" Artem screamed, swinging the branch. The entity opened its maw again. This time, Graf's raspy bark erupted from it. It was so identical that Artem flinched for a second, looking for his dog. That second was enough. The pursuer closed the gap instantly. A cold, steel-strong hand gripped Artem's throat. The fingers felt like dry, weathered parchment. Artem felt his oxygen cut off. The world began to double. The lights below turned into blurry yellow smears. He struck the entity desperately with his free hand, but the blows were swallowed by the heavy fabric of the coat. Suddenly, Artem's fingers brushed something hard on the entity's belt. It was a ring of keys, his asterisk keys, which he had just dropped into the sewer. This thing hadn't just followed him. It had somehow retrieved the keys in seconds. It was playing with him. Just as his consciousness began to fade, a fierce snarl echoed from below. A shadow leapt onto the roof. Graf, the shepherd, limping on one leg, ignored the pain. The dog sank its teeth into the arm gripping his master's throat. Fangs tore through the thick coat. Instead of a scream, the entity let out a sound like breaking glass mixed with a snake's hiss. The grip loosened. Artem collapsed onto the concrete roof, gasping for air. He saw Graf and the pursuer locked in a struggle. The entity tried to throw the dog off, but the shepherd held on with a death grip. Artem realized if he didn't act now, they would both die. He spotted a heavy concrete block nearby that used to hold an antenna. Gathering every ounce of strength, he lifted it and, with a guttural shout, brought it down on the entity's head. There was a dry sound of cracking ceramics. The hood fell back, and Artem saw what lay beneath. There was no skull. Under the skin pulsated a semi-transparent mass, like a glob of dark bile in which dozens of human teeth floated. The entity shuddered and began to shrink rapidly, as if air were being let out of it. The coat emptied, turning into a pile of old, dirty rags. Within seconds, only the heap of clothes, the surgical saw, and Artem's keys remained on the roof. Artem crawled over to Graf. The dog was breathing heavily. His side was bloodied, but his eyes glowed with that same loyal fire. "Let's go, buddy, we have to go," Artem whispered, hugging the dog's neck. He helped Graf up. The descent down the stairs was painful and slow. When they finally reached the ground, the city felt different. The fog had lifted, a car drove by in the distance, and a light flickered on in a third-floor window. The nightmare was over. Artem reached his door and slid the key into the lock. His hand was still shaking. He entered the apartment, locked every bolt, and sank to the floor beside his dog. The flat was quiet and warm. Artem closed his eyes, trying to calm his heart. "It's okay, Graf. We're home," he said softly. And suddenly, from behind the pantry door, a voice responded. A soft, raspy version of Artem's own voice, mimicking his intonation perfectly. "It's okay, Graf. We're home." Artem froze. He slowly turned his head toward the dark hallway. From the gap under the pantry door, a thick, black liquid began to seep out, and a rhythmic asterisk click, click, click asterisk started sounding from inside his own home. It wasn't alone. The familiar warmth of his apartment now felt like a suffocating blanket. The voice from the pantry, his own voice, echoed in his mind, stripping away any last vestige of comfort. Graf, sensing Artem's terror, let out a low, shaky growl, pressing his head against his Ona's leg. Artem pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. He grabbed the closest heavy object, a sturdy umbrella, and approached the pantry door. The black liquid was still seeping, slowly forming a small puddle on the wooden floor. It looked like crude oil, thick and iridescent under the dim light of the hallway. He took a deep breath, his heart threatening to burst from his chest, and slowly, cautiously pushed the pantry door open. The small, usually mundane space was plunged into darkness. The air inside was colder than the rest of the apartment, carrying a faint, metallic scent. Artem fumbled for the light switch. When the bulb flickered to life, revealing the shelves stacked with canned goods and cleaning supplies, he almost dropped the umbrella. Standing in the corner, amidst bags of flour and sugar, was another figure, taller than the one on the roof perhaps, but undeniably the same kind of entity. It was completely naked, its skin a sickly white, stretched taut over an unnaturally elongated frame. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in black, needle-like claws. Its head was small, almost shrunken, with the same hollow pits for eyes and a newly sewn mouth. The black threads still fresh and glistening with the same dark liquid. But the most horrifying detail wasn't its appearance. It was what it held in its hands. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift from his late mother, that usually sat on his bedside table, and next to it, a framed photo of him and Graf smiling, taken just last summer. The entity wasn't just observing, it was collecting. It was asterisk mimicking asterisk. As Artem stared, frozen, the creature slowly raised the wooden bird to its face. Then, with a chillingly familiar movement, it opened its sewn mouth, the black threads taut, revealing the same pulsating, tooth-filled void, and from that void came a sound, the gentle, melancholic melody of his mother's favorite lullaby, a song Artem hadn't thought about in years, hummed in her distinct, slightly wavering voice. It wasn't just stealing sounds, it was stealing memories. It was stealing the essence of his life. Graf, letting out a frustrated bark, lunged forward, but this time the entity didn't even move. It simply extended one of its impossibly long arms, and a thin, almost invisible tendril of black liquid shot out, wrapping around Graf's neck. The dog choked, struggling, but the tendril held firm, slowly lifting him off the ground. Artem screamed, dropping the umbrella and grabbing at the tendril, but it felt like trying to grasp smoke. His hands passed through it, yet it held Graf with unwavering strength. The entity's head tilted, and the lullaby continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Graf's growl mixed with a melody, creating a monstrous symphony of stolen intimacy. Panic surged through Artem. He had faced a predator on the street, But this was different. This was an invasion, a violation of everything he held dear. He looked around wildly for anything at all. His eyes landed on a bottle of cleaning acid under the sink. Desperation overriding fear, he lunged for it. He ripped open the bottle and, without a moment's hesitation, hurled its contents at the creature. The acid hissed and sizzled on the pale skin. The entity recoiled, making a sound like ripping canvas, its form shimmering and wavering. The tendril around Graf's neck dissolved, and the dog fell to the floor, coughing violently. The creature didn't scream in pain. It simply rearranged itself. The skin bubbled and reformed, the acid doing little more than temporarily disrupting its composition. It took a step back, its gaze still fixed on Artem, and then, with unnatural speed, it began to retreat, dissolving into the shadowy corners of the pantry. The black liquid on the floor evaporated. The scent of ozone filled the air. And then silence. Artem rushed to Graf, cradling his trembling dog. Graf licked his hand weakly, his eyes wide with terror. The wooden bird lay on the floor next to the photo. Artem picked them up, his hands shaking. He looked at the pantry, then at the closed front door. He had killed one on the roof, but how many were there? And how did this one get inside? He heard a faint, familiar sound from the living room. The gentle, almost imperceptible creak of his old armchair, as if someone had just settled into it. And then a whisper right behind him, so close it felt like a breath against his ear. Welcome home, Artem asterisk. It was his own voice, perfectly replicated, but tinged with a chilling, possessive amusement. He spun around, but there was nothing, only the silence of his apartment. Artem knew this wasn't just a chase, this was a claiming, and the collection had just begun. He was now part of its symphony. He was its new echo.